All right, we are now recording. Okay, so what I'm going to go over is sort of a recap of what we learned from the first round, so the process up to this point, both from what we heard from the community and from what we learned from our data analysis. I'm going to just hit some of the key bullet points. We learned a lot. We had pages and pages of responses from the community, so I'm not going to have time to go into everything, but I do want to hit the highlights. So first, what we heard. These are things that we heard from everywhere in the city. All areas of the city shared these priorities and values for the future of the city. So our, I'm sorry, Jim, I think we're getting somebody's audio. It's a little bit distracting. Can you mute whoever else is? Okay, thank you. Okay, so first, preserving and restoring our local ecosystems, and not just preserving and restoring them, but having access to them, free public access to our green spaces and water, which is so important to everybody and to quality of life. We have many overlapping jurisdictions throughout the city. Residents want to see more collaboration and coordination, especially when it comes to the maintenance and addressing drainage infrastructure throughout the city. I don't know if y'all heard my dog yawn just then. We have a desire to protect the urban growth boundary. If you're not familiar with what that is, that's the bold line in the map on the left here, sort of delineates where urban growth ends and where outside of the urban growth boundaries where we want to reserve the rural type of development. A lot of folks want to see Gullah Geechee culture and history of the city better protected, preserved, and celebrated. More affordable commercial space, so more support for small local businesses, mixture of housing that can meet the needs of all income levels, life stages, household size, that's close to where people work. A more connected city, not just for cars, but for people who are walking or biking or using a transit system, approved transit system. And then finally, a desire to be involved on a more regular basis with not just planning matters, but other matters of the city, to be engaged beyond this comprehensive plan, to have more transparency and communication with the city. And here are some things that we heard specifically from folks on James Island. So residents of James Island, one of the things I brought out in this is sort of, we asked a question in round one, which is what do you love about your community? And folks from James Island talked about that small town feel. Is a mixture of different types of communities around the island. They're very tight knit. And there's a deep love and connection with the natural landscape, especially old trees surrounding marshes and water. And I'm sure it won't come as a surprise to any of you in the meeting tonight, flooding being top of the mind for folks on James Island, especially. So this is a problem that's getting worse, and this is plaguing residents and definitely impacting quality of life, damaging property on a regular basis. And so wanting to, we heard that it's really critical that any new development is done in a way that preserves open space, protects natural ecosystems, and not just doesn't make flooding worse, but actually can help improve flooding. People love being on James Island because of the proximity to downtown and the beach, but getting around is proving challenging and can be especially unsafe if you don't have a car. And this is getting worse. And so when it comes to connecting to parks, recreation areas, the things that you're close to, improving ways to get around. So better transit, safe pathways for bikes, pedestrians, not just on the island, but connecting to surrounding areas as well. And then this is this was already mentioned, the collaboration between the different jurisdictions, but this is especially this was especially loud amongst folks from James Island. And I think part of that is because not only we have city and county in James Island, but we also have the town of James Island. So that's more folks to bring together and work together, and especially looking at implementing the recommendations in the Rethink Folly Road Plan. And if you're not familiar with Rethink Folly, we can share that information. Maybe Jim can drop that in the chat, and then we'll also share in the follow-up email. Okay, so this next part is a quick overview of some of the key findings from our housing analysis. So we did a deep dive into both our housing challenges and our challenges with flooding, and I'm going to hit the highlights from both of those efforts. Before I get into the housing findings, I want to clarify what we mean when we use the term affordable housing. In this analysis, we are using the definition that the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development, also known as HUD, uses, and that is that they define affordable housing as housing that adds up to no more than 30% of someone's annual income before taxes, and those costs that they're referring to are specifically rent or mortgage prices. And they will set affordability based on someone's income. So it's not a flat affordability, it's tied to what someone makes. And they categorize different income ranges by the percentage that that household makes of the area median income. So for example, someone who's making 30% of the area median income in the Charleston area makes about $17,000 annually, and that's a single person household. So housing that's affordable to that person would add up to no more than 30% of that person's $17,000 annually. Or another example, 60%, if someone makes $34,000 a year, affordable housing for them would be no more than 30% of $34,000 a year. So that's just a little bit of how that's broken down and how affordability is determined. And you may have heard of different categories of affordable housing, like workforce housing or low-income housing. When we're for the purposes of this analysis, we're referring to all income ranges. So housing that is affordable to all of these income ranges up to someone making 120% of the area median income. So this is also probably not news to folks, but it does help to have numbers to put to experiences that we can all relate to. And the cost of living in Charleston is high, and this is reflected in housing costs. So 42% of Charleston residents or households are cost burdened, which just means that they're spending more than that 30% threshold of their annual income on housing costs. And that is just looking at their income versus their mortgage or their rent. It is not including utilities or insurance, so this number is likely higher if you were to factor in those additional costs. We also found that we just looked at one. We broke down the numbers just for white versus Black households. We have not broadened that analysis, but we intend to. But we did find that majority Black neighborhoods with majority Black residents are more than twice as likely to be cost burdened as those with the majority white residents. And this is definitely tied to significant income disparities that we have across race in the city of Charleston. And we have the cost burden percentage by area of the city. So James Island is about 38% cost burden, which is lower than some of the other areas, but not as low as Kenai Peninsula, which includes Daniel Island and the Wando communities. We also understand that there's a lot more that factors into why someone chooses to live where they live. It's not just how much it costs. It could be how close it is to work, their age, their family size. And so those are all things that need to be considered when we're planning for the future, not just the cost of housing, We also need to be looking at places that are vulnerable to tidal flooding based on the vulnerability assessment completed this in 2020. We know now currently 6% of residential parcels will be vulnerable to tidal flooding with 3 feet of sea level rise, which is the current prediction. We also looked at the transportation costs. If we include transportation costs in overall calculations, places that may be more affordable on the housing side may cost more on the transportation side. And so we wanted to see how the different areas of the city compared when looking at not just housing costs, but transportation costs. You can see the breakdown here in James Island. On average, the average household pays about $3,000 a month on housing and transportation combined. And so this is very close to the overall cost for living both downtown and on Johns Island. And then finally, we looked at what our housing need is for the future in terms of the cost of housing going forward. So if 42% of our current households are cost burdened, and we anticipate our population to grow in the next 10 years, if our incomes and housing costs rise or stay the same, that ratio stays the same over the next 10 years with population growth, we will need over about 16,000 units to be more affordable than they are now by 2030 to meet the income needs of not just our residents now, but going forward. And the greatest need in terms of affordable housing is for folks who are making 30% or less of the area median income. So 7,000, more than 7,000 of that 16,000 is needed for just that income range. And we also looked at each area of the city. And so if you're wondering how we got to these numbers, this is a very hypothetical scenario, but this just sort of shows what the need is. The need is everywhere. So it's not just one part of the city where we need more affordable housing. We need more affordable housing everywhere. And so these numbers really just show you a comparison of the need across the city. And this is based on, again, our current numbers and also projected population. And it's also based on the existing income distribution of that area. So in James Island, we're looking at a need of just under 2,000 more affordable units in the next 10 years. Okay, thanks. Jim is sharing a lot of resources in the chat. Okay, the next piece is our water and land analysis. So if you're familiar with the Dutch dialogues, the group that we worked with on this analysis is the same folks who worked on the Dutch dialogues, and they take an approach to planning that looks at the ground, the soil, water, and ecology, infrastructure, drainage and transportation networks, and habitation, which includes development and land use. This plan, the city plan, is going to guide primarily that top layer, which is the inhabitation layer. So it's going to guide, the recommendations in it are intended to guide development and land use decisions. We will not be making specific recommendations for like infrastructure projects, but the plan can make recommendations about priority areas for investment in terms of infrastructure for both drainage and transportation networks. What we were missing in this layered approach to planning was a citywide analysis of this ground level, the soil, water, and ecology. So that is what this analysis focused on, was informing us our conditions, soil, water, and ecology, and what to expect with sea level rise going forward so that we can plan accordingly. There's actually just under 300 pages in this report. And I only have 4 slides. So this is a very high level summary just to give you sort of the most important points. One of the things that came out of this analysis was the elevation risk zones that were assigned for all parts of the city. And we're going to share this tonight specifically because this map in particular, this part of the analysis is what informed our the land use maps, which we'll be looking at later tonight. So this analysis assigned 4 categories across the city: high ground, where there's the least risk of flooding, but also the greatest responsibility to make sure to be good neighbors to those downstreams. The adapt zone is where flooding is not impossible, but it is less frequent, and where this area is going to experience change and will need to change to adapt to our changing landscape. But it is possible still to have development in these areas and adapt in a way to respond to the changing environment. The compound flood risk zone is sort of this very nuanced area that's an overlap between the adapt zone and the tidal flood risk zone, where there's a combination of things going on. And that is, it could be, it's a mixture of tidal flooding and rainfall and runoff, where they all kind of coalesce. And those areas are fewer, but it is sort of it's a place for more research. And then there is a greater flooding risk definitely in this area. The place at most risk in the city is the tidal flood risk zone. So these are places where today they may experience already high tide flooding, even on a sunny day. And these areas are going to see more of that going forward as the sea level rises. And this is also a dynamic area where the marsh is expected to, in many places, to actually move inland. So marsh migration will occur in these areas. These areas have the greatest risk. This is a zoomed in map, or a zoomed in look at the elevation risk zones for James Island. So along the top here, that high ground on the top of the map is along Maybank Highway. If you go down Folly Road, let me see if I can turn on my spotlight here. On the top here, Maybank Highway is high ground, surrounded by some adapt zone. If you go down Folly Road, down to right north of where the current urban growth boundary is, there is some more high ground, and then up Fort Johnson Road, there is some additional high ground off to the right. So this is, and again, this will be shared afterward. And then finally, they gave us some recommendations for planning strategies that we want to use everywhere. So not just in certain land use categories, but these are planning strategies that need to be used in combination in all land use categories in all places in the city, depending on very site-specific conditions. So these are tools that we need to have in our toolbox as we go forward and apply appropriately. And these will be enforced primarily through zoning and stormwater regulations and other policy tools. And this is my last piece here. This is a research project that came out of our first round of engagement. And that is to the community, several community members. Sorry, I can't turn off my, okay, good, it went away. My little highlight pen. We heard from folks the desire to for the city to better protect and work with African-American settlement communities, and doing further research, realized that a lot of these communities had not been formally documented on a map. And so we have been working to rectify that as sort of step one to be able to do more to protect and preserve these communities and sort of plan being more sensitive to the historic and cultural significance of these areas. So if you're not familiar with what an African American settlement community is, it's a community that's been settled by formerly enslaved people and Gullah Geechee people throughout the Low Country. These all have they're not all the same. They're all very unique, and but they do all pretty much. What makes them similar is their shared history. Each community has a shared history, shared identity. There's a strong connection to the land, and there's typically there's shared cultural institutions, schools, churches, and businesses. And so I share that definition. It's a working definition, and we're always, this is sort of evolving as we go, because the communities, residents of these communities are really guiding this and steering us. So this is a working, evolving definition, but it is a more broad definition than what you may have seen if you're familiar with this term, that you may have seen in other historic resource surveys. So the scope of this project is to identify the communities on a map, where they are, what they're called, their significance, a brief part of their history, and then to include recommendations for beyond the plan, how we can work to protect and preserve them. And I will pause here. And I'm sorry, Thatika, I think I went longer tonight.
That is okay. Okay. All right. So we actually do have a question in the chat. And thank you, Chloe. We actually do have a question in the chat, and it's coming from Eileen. This is great that you're looking at surface stormwater flooding. Have you looked at / analyzed the potential changes to the water table as a result of development?
I'll take an attempt at that. So Eileen, yeah, that is not something we've done in this document. It's a very involved engineering type process. It would involve, core samples, things like that, all different parts of the city. But I will say that as development occurs, particularly in the adapt and reserve areas like that, that would need to be a key part of analysis as new development comes in, part of, just getting ready for understanding the stormwater on a particular site.
Hey, this is Eileen Doherty. Thank you so much, Christopher. I only bring this up because this is something that we've experienced so much in our area, and that when we do have large scale developments that go in relatively low lying areas that are built up significantly, it does change the water table in the surrounding areas as far as we can tell. And I think that's one of the things that when we approached the city of Charleston about that, we were unable to really find any resolution, because that didn't seem to be covered by any of the local zoning ordinances. So we just wanted to flag that as something that's very important. And I know that it may be on a case-by-case basis, but often the developers are not doing that with the same numbers that perhaps a regulatory body would be. Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen.
I might want to just add one more piece to that, is sort of at the same time that we are sort of finalizing the plan, our stormwater department is also finalizing a very comprehensive, more engineering level study of the city. So these things are happening simultaneously. And so we, the planners, we haven't been doing that study, and we don't have that data right in front of us yet, but that is also being finished up now. And so that is improved data, better data than the cities had access to before. And those numbers will be used in reviewing future development plans as well. So that is something to look forward to. Christopher, did I represent those efforts accurately? Okay.
Okay. All right. We have another question. Melissa shared, I continue to be concerned about the African American community issues that concentrate on the history, and that's vital. And she also shared, but African American communities, and what about African American communities in business development?
Yes, I can respond to that, and thank you, Dr. Brown. Yes, I think previously I think I need to be more consistent with how we talk about this project and certainly make sure that the recommendations in the plan reflect what you think we should be including in the plan for this, and how we, that we don't over focus on the history and preservation. And so I think another way I've said it is, how are we, what is the vision that these communities have for themselves, and how can the city support that vision? So whether that, if that includes preservation, if that includes investment in businesses and development, and how can we support that vision? And so thank you for that reminder that it's not just about preservation, and we'll please hold us to it, make sure that our recommendations are reflecting that and not over focusing on that preservation and the history.
All right, thank you. Any other questions before we move on, or thoughts? Okay. And I think Christopher, you're next.
Okay, let's look at some of the select draft recommendations from the document that we are working on. Next slide. Okay. So we have this slide. I think we've done this with our groups in the fall, but just a reminder of what a plan does. And that is that a plan makes recommendations about the future and uses objective information and gets everyone's input for our kind of daily use in the planning department and making recommendations to the Planning Commission, City Council. But it's not something that immediately changes zoning. It may have recommendations for changes to zoning, but it does not change them just by virtue of its adoption. It also does not change stormwater regulations or change taxation. So it's a guiding document. It's a foundation for our policies. So just so everybody understands that differential there. Next slide. And so we have the 10 key elements. And again, these are all things that we've kind of outlined in the past, but of course, population. Unfortunately, we won't have the new census information in this document because the census has been delayed, but we have our own internal estimates, and we also have American Community Survey, which is an offshoot of the census. We have their estimates from as recently as 2019. We have economic development elements in the plan, natural resources, background, cultural resources, community facilities, housing, of course, as we've already outlined, land use, which we're going to go into a little bit more depth in just a few minutes, transportation, which we have a citywide transportation plan that's been incorporated into the document, and then priority investment for where investment in infrastructure should be, and resilience, how we kind of tie all these elements together to make our city a more resilient city.
Christopher, before we go to the next slide, we only have prepared in slides tonight the land use recommendations, specifically in the form of the land use maps. But I did, in the document that I sent out to everyone before this meeting, it includes recommendations for the other elements. So though we're not going to present those recommendations tonight because we don't have time, we welcome any feedback if you've come prepared with any feedback for other things aside from the land use, or want to send that feedback afterward. I just wanted to draw attention that we're only going to focus on number 7 here tonight just because of time, but there's a lot more to it than that.
So we're going to look into our future land use maps. And these are maps that bring together the various aspects of the plan into a visual guide for our land use across the city over the next 10 years. It's hopefully incorporating community's vision. We want to hear from you all to see if you agree with this. And then it's going to, as I said earlier, it's going to help us make decisions and recommendations now and into the future for Planning Commission and City Council. And it's a general guide, essentially. It's not a set of laws. Next slide. And our water analysis implications for land use have the fact that we want to reserve higher intensity land use categories for higher ground zones. So keeping those that intensity away from the areas that are most vulnerable. We want to assign the lowest impact land use categories, such as conservation and parks, to the majority of areas within the tidal flood risk zone. And then we want to have in between those two zones, we can accommodate some of the mid and low intensity land use categories, but we have to make sure that each of those uses has appropriate site-specific planning and mitigation strategies for the stormwater and the off-site impacts there might be from those uses. Next slide. So these are the designations that you're going to see on the maps in just a few minutes. We have a rural category. This is for designated areas outside the urban growth boundary. An example might be the Plow Ground Road area on Johns Island. Then we have our suburban edge, which is generally suburban in character, but lower densities than typical suburban residential areas. It's 1 unit an acre to 4 units an acre. Sandhurst might be an example in West Ashley, or Stiles Point on James Island. Then we have our suburban category, which is the bulk of the city. It's 4 dwelling units an acre to 8 dwelling units an acre. Examples might include St. John's Woods on Johns Island, or Riverland Terrace on James Island. Next slide. Then neighborhood is a category that really refers to the types of densities you see in areas a little bit more like some of the downtown neighborhoods. It's 6 dwelling units to 12 dwelling units. It's not as typically found in suburban areas. Ansonboro would be an example downtown. Then neighborhood edge is something that we have put in this document for the first time. It's something that allows for those types of uses that are needed in every neighborhood, stores and services, but they aren't appropriate to be in the middle of the neighborhood. So they might be on the edge of the neighborhood along a key corridor, along a Savannah highway, or along a Folly Road. We'd had some categories in the past that were called highway that we felt like were too intensive oriented and too auto oriented. And we felt like neighborhood edge is something that helps us create something more like an Avondale. That was kind of the model of the neighborhood edge concept. And then finally, we have our city centers, which are based on, the most intense uses, hopefully at the higher elevations around the city. These include our downtowns, urban core, also Citadel Mall areas, the higher elevation areas of Citadel Mall, and then Daniel Island Town Center, and then we'll show a few other ones scattered around the city at locations of higher elevations. Next slide. And then some of the unique districts we have, such as a campus district. A case in point would be the medical district, which is unique uses that work together as one, but they're in different formats of buildings. The buildings don't follow necessarily the standard urban format. Medical district or College of Charleston. Also high school campuses such as James Island Charter High School's campus. Then we have job centers, which would be areas where there are a lot of small businesses or almost light industrial type uses together with some commercial uses. This example of this would be like the Doo-Wop area in West Ashley, or the Fort Johnson research area, where DNR and other regulatory agencies have offices, the Hollings, NOAA labs, things like that. And then we have our industrial areas, and those are where you have uses that could have off-site impacts and the most intensive types of job generating uses. Columbus Street Terminal is an example of that. I think you all also on James Island have the Signal Point industrial area as well. Next slide. And then the areas that would have very low development impact, such as low impact and conserved areas, which would be low elevation lands and potential tidal flood risk areas and future marsh migration areas. There could be some limited development of these, but the structures are likely need to be elevated so as not to impair the natural intertidal systems. The land uses that are going to be recommended in this plan document have those as less than 1 unit per acre, if there's any development at all. And then we also have lands that are preserved via public ownership, not necessarily open to the general population, but just preserved through a land trust, something like that. Then we have, of course, natural and wetland areas that already exist. And then we have parks that are owned by localities for the public's outdoor recreational uses and passive uses. So this is the initial draft James Island future land use map. The first thing a lot of you might notice is the dark color, though it's almost like a black color. That is areas that are in the town of James Island. And because the town of James Island is so intermingled with the city, and because it is its own entity and they have their own plans, we felt it was important to show that, you know, their planning is for their kind of jurisdiction. We are going to be cooperating with them. In fact, we'll be setting up a meeting soon to have a joint discussion of our plan and get their thoughts on what is in our plan and have some more coordination with what's in their plan. But that's why it shows this way on this map. Then it has different areas of James Island that we can focus in on. We also have an item that is a proposal to deal with a quirk that is in the lower area of the urban growth boundary. The urban growth boundary is the dark gray line that comes onto James Island near the Grimble area and goes around the Signal Point Industrial Park and then heads east over to Secessionville and then heads south on Folly Road. And for whatever reason, when this line was drawn, you know, over 20 years ago, it included Ocean neighbors in the rural area and a lot of Lower Folly Road. And over time, that area has had some commercial designations given to it. In fact, all of Folly Road, all the properties that front on Folly Road now have commercial designations and other designations through the Folly Road overlay for all the properties that front on Folly. And we feel that that weakens the urban growth boundary if we've got those urban type designations or suburban type designations in an area that technically is outside the UGB. So what this document shows is an idea that could move the urban growth boundary to the outer edge of properties on the west side of Folly Road, following the Folly Road overlay boundary, so that all the bulk of the Grimble area to the west would stay in the rural area, but just properties fronting on Folly Road would come inside the UGB. This is just an idea we're throwing out. You know, if folks don't like this idea, we can certainly remove it, but we felt it was very important in this era where we hear a lot of people talk about strengthening the urban growth boundary. Our feeling is that this is an area of weakness in the urban growth boundary because we've got zonings that are outside it that are not compatible with being in the rural area, and this was an important change. When we reviewed the entire urban growth boundary around the entire city, this was the only area that we saw weaknesses in it. So that's why we highlighted it here. If we can go to the next slide. And this is this lower area on Folly Road that gives you a sense of what's in the Folly Road overlay and shows some of the zonings that are in place there at present. I can go over these if there are more questions and all, but suffice to say that this area is filled with a lot of non-rural type zonings that are already on the land and non-rural type land uses such as ocean neighbors, such as spyglass condominiums, things like that, that, you know, don't, in our minds, allow for the strengthening of the urban growth boundary. And I'll leave it at that, and we'll move on to other images here. So this is also an image that shows parks and conserved lands. And James Island is very fortunate to have lots and lots of parks and conserved lands, particularly compared to other areas of the city. I think it ranks as one of the highest areas of the city as far as the amount of acreage percentage-wise that is devoted to parks and conserved lands. And I think maybe what we will do also, I want to leave an opportunity to for folks to look at the map there that we were showing, the land use map. If we want to go back to it, or we could wait till the end, but this was the map, just to see if there are any questions about this, if anybody wanted areas zoomed in on or anything like that. We also have a segment where we are going to talk about the changes that are here. So maybe that's a good opportunity also for people to focus in on the recommendations from this map. So here we have the areas for future growth are determined by elevations, the high ground, and also current and future transit infrastructure. So what we found in looking at James Island, not surprisingly, is that the high ground, as Chloe outlined earlier, is in kind of old waves, kind of like Johns Island has to a degree, where old beach dunes and things like that were. And this created the basis of higher zones across the island in kind of ribbons. And one of those ribbons was along Maybank Highway. Folly Road goes across a couple of those ribbons, but as a whole, it's not uniformly that way. But Folly Road also is a very good potential future rapid transit, bus rapid transit type corridor. And so we see that as hopefully coloring some of the land use along Folly Road in the future, since it's an area that could be more walkable and could allow people to be less dependent on their own cars. We have the neighborhood edge, as I mentioned earlier, that views the periphery of neighborhoods as places of connection between the nearby residential area and multimodal transportation routes, again, like Folly Road. We have the low impact and preserve designation, which is in response to the land and water analysis, which has areas of the city that are not appropriate for many types of future development due to the sea level rise potential or flooding and marsh migration. The city center, we have a couple of areas that are showing that way on James Island, and I would be happy to talk about those. We have the neighborhood designation that is not as many areas on James Island. And then, of course, because it's denser, like we would see in Ansonburg downtown. And then we have the African-American settlement communities that Chloe's already outlined as well. Next slide. And again, Maybank Highway has some of the highest elevation on the island. And oops, we jumped ahead. It has the already designated higher density area from urban center to city center, and a slight expansion of the city center category to include areas previously under suburban. And this is based purely on the elevations that exist along Maybank Highway. And then there is the proposed alternative that we've talked about to the UGB along Lower Folly Road. Next slide. And then we go into